October, a thin frost on the grass, a peninsula of black water folding into early morning fog. I was supposed to be off the grid for a week. That was the plan. And in a way, it was true. I booked 3 different places over 3 months, each stay meant to be a retreat and a small test of a new home security system I was writing about. I had a reason for going. After a year of stories piling up on my desk and a burglary in an apartment downtown that left me shaking, I wanted to see how ordinary houses and remote cabins behaved when the usual routines stopped. I told myself it was professional curiosity. I told those close to me it was a break. In truth, I wanted to stop waking at 3 a.m., convinced someone was outside my window. The first night at the Lakehouse felt like the reset button we all look for. The owner left a note pinned under a jar of matches. Pull the boat fully onto the beach and tie it to the cedar post. There was no cell signal. The VHF radio had a single programmed emergency channel. The dock creaked when you stood at the end, and the generator lived in a rusted shed that smelled of fuel and old rope. The water that first afternoon was a flat sheet, so cold it reflected the birch trees like burned silver. I remember the way the lantern I had brought threw a steady orange halo across the porch boards, how my breath fogged the glass, how the knot on my bootlace had come undone and I retied it 3 times without thinking. It was supposed to be ordinary comfort. It was supposed to stop the small alarms in my chest. Instead, it offered the very things that would keep me awake for months. A handful of simple instructions, a quiet house, and 3 nights where the ordinary turned into something else. I grew up in a house that never felt safe. My mother locked the back door at noon and left a note on the table if she went out into the garden. My father worked nights on the docks and taught me to listen to the change in tide, the way the wind moved through loose siding. That childhood added a language to my senses, a small vocabulary of creaks and drafts and how they signaled either weather or someone else. Later, in college, I studied journalism and started doing long-form pieces about homelessness and break-ins. I learned to ask for receipts, for patrol logs, for the paperwork that made fear legible. After a theft in my apartment, where nothing seemed to be missing and everything felt gone, I moved into a different kind of life. I began testing security in occupied and abandoned spaces, writing about the mismatch between what people think protects them and what actually does. The loss taught me to be meticulous. It taught me to name things. It taught me that sometimes the simplest instruction from a homeowner matters because it was written after experience, not theory. Those parts of my past threaded directly into the nights I spent on remote porches listening to water, into the small panic of a light flicking across a shore, into the late calls with Officer Ramirez, who always asked for dates as if time itself could turn a story into evidence. The backstory is not the start of the story. It is the reason I could hear the difference between wind and footfall. It is why I left at 2 in the morning of the second night with a lantern and a hatchet and a feeling that the lake had just become a page I needed to read. My first week was the Lakehouse on the north arm of a long, narrow lake. The owner, Mark, had answered my messages in clipped texts and left a binder by the kettle with a handwritten page titled Essentials. The binder said things like, the generator starts with 2 poles, the oars are under the back seat, the boat has a small prop guard that sometimes rubs against weeds. It also said, in one clean line that felt like a warning, do not leave the door unlocked at night. I laughed when I read that, at the touch of dramatic caution, and the water outside laughed back by remaining unchanged. My routine became predictable. Morning coffee, a walk along the narrow trail through marsh grass, checking the knot on the dock line, testing the VHF, even though there was nothing on the channel but static and the distant gull. There were sensory details that felt safe. The cabin smelled of dry pine and old copper. The floorboard by the stove always creaked a particular way that sounded like a sigh. I kept a small prop, my notebook, on the table and a charged lantern at the ready. I would set the generator for 2 hours at dusk to warm the place, then shut it off before midnight to eat the quiet. On the second night, after I had been writing for an hour and the porch light sent a small circle of comfort into the dark, I saw a blink of light across the lake. It was a small, precise blink, like someone tapping a mirror with a fingertip. 3 quick flashes, a pause, 3 quick flashes. For a second, I thought it was a boat returning and someone using a lantern to call. I pictured a neighbor. I imagined Mark coming to check the lines. I kept watching, and the light kept repeating. It was not the usual prop of a fisherman coming home. It felt deliberate. When I woke Sarah, who had driven up for the weekend, she blinked at me, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She saw the light too. We went through a series of low, practical exchanges that lasted too long to be satisfactory and not long enough to be comforting. Our dialogue that night stretched into a small performance of normality and fear. I asked if she wanted to wake Mark. She whispered that he was 2 miles and a boat away and that there was no way to phone him. I suggested we take the boat and see. She reminded me that we were amateurs on water at 2 a.m. She said perhaps the light was from a kayak. I said kayaks do not have signals like that. She said maybe it was a light from a house across the 200 yards of water. I said I could see the rhythm. She said maybe we should call the station on the VHF. I said we had no license to interfere. She said we were not interfering if someone needed help. I said the rational thing, check the cameras in the shed. She laughed without humor and asked where those cameras would be. I said I had placed a small motion camera by the dock earlier in the day as a test. She said, okay, check it then. In those 8 exchanges, we traded the work of decision-making, the slow building of courage, and the thin thread of terror. And every line added a small gap that could be filled with action or silence. We chose to watch. The camera, when I reviewed the clip with hands that would not stop trembling, showed a shadow slipping along the far edge of the trees, a face that the infrared could not reveal, a bright pulse of light moving to the dock on our side of the lake and disappearing. The image cut to black, as if someone had reached for it with gloved hands. At that 32 to 35% mark of my own stay, when the light first became evidence and the sleep left for good, I paused here because I want to hear from you. If you were on that porch with us, would you shout into the dark or stay perfectly silent? Write "I would shout" or "I would stay" in the comments before you continue. Most people pick one instinct that feels like courage. Some pick another that feels like strategy. Your answers have helped me in other videos decide what safety questions to prioritize, and the way you share small choices changes how I approach these nights. Now continue with me. When the light finally stopped, we did not shout. Instead, we listened. The night escalated slowly. First came evidence that someone had been on our property, the way a small wind might leave the blinds in odd positions. The rope that tied the boat was slightly loosened, though I was certain I had tied it tight. The lantern that had been on the porch bench was moved closer to the door. There were tiny breadcrumbs of mud on the step that did not match the shoes we had brought. I noted these with a journalist's checklist. Sensibility, but my chest had a voice that kept whispering in plain language, "You are not alone." I called Officer Ramirez in the nearest town, who had become a familiar voice in my phone book. Ramirez told me to stay put, to not confront whoever it was, and to keep the generator off because intruders often come to remove heat sources or to sabotage lines. He asked for times and details and took them down with the kind of care that turns rumor into a record. About an hour later, a flashlight beam skated across the far shore, a steady sweep that seemed to comb the water. We could have been the subject of that sweep. The beam found the dock, paused, and then retreated. That pause felt like a punctuation mark. We wavered between being watched and watching. The boat's prop had been unscrewed. The manual anchor line cut frayed, as if by a sharp tool. The generator's fuel gauge read lower than we had left it. These were small acts of sabotage with a very particular intention, to isolate. The way someone had cut a knot at the cleat on the dock was not clumsy, it was practiced. I confronted the technical details with a kind of grim attention because the details were the language of safety. The cut at the cleats suggested a serrated pocket knife or a specialized paring tool. A typical cutting pattern left jagged fibers. This left a clean scissor finish. The prop guard on the boat had been slightly bent inward, causing a drag that would have made a silent approach slow and noisy. The VHF had been tuned to a channel that only traffic used at sunrise, not the emergency channel it should have been on. These procedures, I noted later in a checklist, became part of the report I filed with the county. The procedural description the detective later read out in a sober voice at the station was short and precise. The chain of custody for the motion camera footage was established by the owner when I left corporeal evidence in the form of a signed, time-stamped log. The footage was cloned to 2 separate drives and sealed, and samples of the rope fibers were photographed and bagged for analysis. The write-up I handed Officer Ramirez was roughly 320 characters of dry, clinical description of what might have been the intruder's tools. That kind of meticulousness was a habit I had learned the only way you ever learn such things, by not trusting memory alone. A night of almost confrontations tends to gather words and to empty them. During the long hours, I kept a lantern by the door, an old hatchet leaned against the wall, and the little red VHF radio on the shelf. I talked out loud to Sarah as a way to test the sound, to fill the rooms with human breath. Our dialogues in moments of high tension became longer and more jagged. In the central confrontation, which happened toward sunrise, we had a sequence that read like a script. The person who came to the dock was not, as it turned out, a stranger with a torch. It was Mark's neighbor Elena, stumbling by in waders, face white with cold, carrying a wet lantern. In the exchange that followed, which I will reproduce roughly as it occurred, and in which you can hear the rise and fall of accusation and explanation, there were 10 back and forths that clarified more than a single shouting match could. I said, "Elena, what are you doing here?" She said, "I heard shouting. I came to see if someone was hurt." I said, "We saw the light." She said, "I have been marking buoys. They sometimes flash when the batteries die." I said, "This light was different. It blinked purposeful." She said, "Maybe someone is signaling for help across the lake." I said, "Who would be signaling?" She said, "Fishermen sometimes signal each other." I said, "The rope on our boat was cut." She said, "Maybe a raccoon or a snapping turtle?" I said, "Raccoons do not use knives." She said, "Then who?" I said, "We reported it." She said she had seen a small skiff on the far side earlier and thought little of it. She asked if we wanted her to go look. I said, "No, stay with us." She said, "Fine, but I will walk the trail and check the marsh." We argued softer after that, and in those softer exchanges, there was relief and the sudden awkwardness of being seen in fear. The exchanges revealed character and intention, and Elena's presence was at once explanation and new mystery. The climax of that first story arrived not in a fight, but in a suffocating, careful peering into what had been done to ordinary things. In one scene, I crept behind the shed with a flashlight and found a small panel of torn netting, a place where someone had been using the crawl space beneath the porch as a staging ground. There were boot prints, 3 different sizes, and a smear of something like diesel on a glove left on the step. I listened to the silence after I found it. The silence had the shape of clothes that only barely fit. The confrontation then shifted from a meeting to an assembly of facts. We had been intentionally isolated by someone who understood small needs of those who camp by the lake: fuel, silence, a loosened boat, to buy time. We felt violated, but also oddly relieved to have an explanation that fit the evidence. It is always better to have a story that makes sense than to live with a possibility that eats holes in you. Officer Ramirez took the evidence. Elena recounted seeing a small skiff, and Mark, who arrived that morning in an actual rowboat, swore up and down that someone had been playing a cruel game. He tightened his face when he said the word game. Forensics team delayed a day because the weather had washed part of the trail, but they dusted the porch and bagged fibers and found a brand of adhesive tape on an anchor line that matched a roll sold only at a hardware store in the next town. The procedural write-up I later got a copy of read like a legal skeleton. Chain of custody established, tape sample cross-referenced with sales logs, surveillance requests filed with local merchants, no confession. The follow-up was slow and hydraulic. It moved by inches and phone calls, and the sort of delays that turn urgency into paperwork. After the Lakehouse, the second story took place in a modest suburban home in a cul-de-sac, a 3-hour drive away. The house belonged to my friend Ben and his partner Clara. They lived in a stretch of street where gulls seemed out of place, and the strip mall shadowed the playground. The kitchen had a jar of brittle cookies and a small tracker unit on the windowsill that pinged to an app. Ben invited me to stay for a night because their alarm had gone off 2 times in 1 week, and the company that maintained their system could not explain the false triggers. The night we arrived, the router blinked a patient blue, the tracker reported motion by the back gate, and the neighborhood was a chorus of air conditioning and late cars. My routine there was different. I walked the perimeter with a flashlight, checked the fence for cuts, felt the chain on the gate for slack, and listened to the sound the house made when it settled. I knew the jargon: perimeter alarm, sensor calibration, camera cone. My presence was both comfort and complicity. At 2 in the morning, the alarm hiccuped. The app on Ben's phone flashed a red icon. We had been through this before, but this time the motion sensor in the backyard registered a human-sized heat signature moving in a slow arc along the fence. Ben swore there was a raccoon or a stray dog. I knew better. In the climb to the second confrontation, conversations lengthened and theories proliferated. We conversed in measured exchanges, 6 or more, because this was a secondary scene. Ben said, "Check the gate." I said I did. Clara said, "The latch is fine." Ben said, "Maybe someone is testing which houses are empty." I said cameras rarely pick up features at that hour in this kind of yard because of glare. Clara asked if the tracker could be spoofed. Ben said the company had updated the firmware last month. I said then someone had physical access to the fence or a thermal blanket. Clara asked about drones. I said a drone would show up on the neighbor's CCTV. Over those 6 lines, we laid out possible explanations, and little by little, the idea formed. This was targeted. The tension peaked in the backyard as the motion sensor tripped again and a figure passed behind the line of ornamental maples. We followed a cautious choreography, splitting roles the way people do when they are afraid and still want to maintain a sense of order. I stayed low by the sliding door with a flashlight and a compact hatchet. Ben circled with a bolt cutter for the gate latch, and Clara called the alarm company while whispering into the phone, telling an operator to hold until police could arrive. The sequence of exchanges in the confrontation that followed was long. The dispatcher asked for names, I gave them. The operator told us to stay on the line. Ben whispered that he could see movement. Clara said, "Call the neighbor." The neighbor answered and said his outdoor camera showed someone in a hoodie. I asked the neighbor to freeze the footage and put it on the app. Ben said the figure was small and moving fast. Clara said her mother had once had a similar break-in. I said not to jump to patterns, and the operator said police were 10 minutes away. Those 10 minutes are a universe. They expand and compress every memory you have. The figure turned out to be a teenager, pale and shaking on the other side of the fence, who said he had been dared to ring doorbells and then run. His hoodie had a smear of paint and a small battery pack taped to the strap, which suggested he had been attempting to trigger motions for fun or malice. The police took his statement and turned it into juvenile paperwork and a lecture. They asked Ben to update the sensor constellation, to move cameras to wider arcs, to plant a motion light. The technical advice was useful and clinical. Adjust sensitivity, rearrange cam cones, log all events with timestamps. The procedural summary in the report was 280 characters of crisp recitation about the battery pack, the child's admission, and the advisory to update perimeter lighting. We all felt safer because the explanation fit. We also felt uneasy because the boy had known the route the sensors took. We had been mapped. The third story was quietly different. This took place in a small apartment above an old deli in a college town where I'd once lived. The apartment belonged to my friend Elena, who had been at the lake that same winter, and whose presence in both stories thinned the line between neighbor and participant. Her building had a cellar that smelled of onions and old newspapers, an ancient electric heater with a metal grate, and a landlord named Tom who liked to fix things with an improvised screwdriver. Elena had been getting packages stolen for months. The thief never took everything, always something small and personal: a bracelet, a note, a paperback book. The pattern was precise in its imprecision. She put a small trail camera in a shoebox by the front door and charged it when she left for work. On the footage was a woman who looked ordinary, but who moved with an economy of motion detective work would later describe as premeditated. She watched the door, slipped a hand into the mail slot, and took something wrapped in a brown paper bag. Elena wanted confrontation and closure. She asked me to stay one night to see if the thief would come again. The tension there was intimate and slow. We watched footage with the kind of attention that makes time feel elastic. The camera showed a silhouette. The woman wore a scarf that blocked her lower face. She had a limp. We later learned from Clara, who now did private investigations on the side, that limps are sometimes strategic. They lower suspicion. When the woman came again, we confronted her at the stairwell and had an extended conversation that was 9 exchanges long, because this was a central scene in its own right and not a mere incident. I asked her why she kept taking packages. She said she needed the money. I asked why she never took anything of significant value. She said some things were left because they were memories, not goods. I asked if she understood the harm of disappearing someone's mail. She shrugged and said she had children. I asked where her children were. She said they slept in a van down by the station. I asked why not ask for help. She said no one asked a woman with a limp for her name and offered assistance. I said that did not absolve theft. She said she had been unseen for a long time. I said I would call the shelter. She said the shelters were full. I said you could have asked Tom, the landlord. She said Tom would have called the cops. I asked if she wanted help now. She said maybe. That exchange did not result in handcuffs. It resulted in a referral, a phone number, a boot of compassion, and an uneasy sense of rescue that might well be temporary. The police took her name, and she was not charged after we agreed to community service and to accept a referral to a local outreach program. The procedural note from the precinct later recorded the incident as theft and a diversion program recommendation. It was 260 characters of bureaucracy and mercy. Across the 3 stories, some threads repeated: the way ordinary objects become evidence, how a hatchet moves from tool to protection, how a lantern becomes both comfort and signal, how a VHF and a small tracker can make a map of presence and absence. There were also people who recurred like a motif: Mark, the owner; Sarah, my traveling companion; Officer Ramirez, the calm detective; Elena, the neighbor; Ben and Clara, the couple who invited me into their chaos; Tom, the landlord, who fixed things badly; and a percussive presence of a forensic expert named Luis, who later looked at fibers and declared them consistent with a tape brand. Those names are not incidental. They anchor the stories. They do not make the fear less real. They make it narratable and therefore survivable. There were 3 moments of pure, expanded tension that I remember the most, each worthy of its own paragraph of sustained dread. The first was the lantern blinking across the black water, and our decision to do nothing, and then to watch, to let the evidence accumulate. The second was the teenager at the fence with a battery pack, a small malice turned juvenile. The third was the woman with a limp taking parcels and then meeting the human hand that asked why. Each moment deserves to be held in small, steady strokes. The lake moment lasted hours, with the boat rope cut and the cleat sliced. The suburb moment compressed into 10 minutes, but felt like an entire night. The apartment moment continued into weeks of outreach and check-ins. Each of these peaks had a quiet paragraph of 500 to 600 characters where I wrote down the sensory center of the fear: the metallic bite of the cold lantern switch, the smell of a teenager's cigarette on the wind, the sickly sweet odor of old onions, and whatever loneness smells like in a stairwell. In the aftermath, help arrived in small units of human procedure. Officer Ramirez came down the dirt lane to the lake with 2 deputies and a flashlight that made everything look clinical. They took our statements and drew diagrams in the dirt with a pen like children inventing maps. At Ben's house, uniformed officers parked with amber lights and spoke to the teenagers with a combination of patience and warning. For Elena, the police note was a form and a recommendation. There were forensic swabs and a single day where men in gloves came to the lake to lift prints from the cleat and photograph the prop guard. The forensic expert, Luis, who later examined the fibers, explained in plain words how adhesive tape can carry unique micro-sizes of filler that match rolls sold in particular stores. He described the process of comparing adhesive residues under a microscope, the way layers can preserve patterns of use. It was the sort of technical explanation that makes you trust authority because it feels slow and exact. The write-ups from these investigations contained the necessary language: chain of custody, sample preservation, matched sale logs, and, in the case of the apartment, a diversion referral with contact numbers for social services. Each procedural description I recorded later for the piece was about 300 characters long, precise and dry, because the cool accounting of facts often steadies people more than emotional language does. The legal and social consequences unfolded unevenly. The county filed a report after the lake incident, but there were no arrests. Instead, there were calls to the hardware store, a cross-reference to a single roll of tape sold a week prior to a vehicle that matched a license plate observed by a fisherman. The license plate belonged to a man who had moved away shortly thereafter. At Ben's, the teenager received a warning and community service. The juvenile's parents paid for some repair to the fence. In Elena's case, the young woman with the limp accepted a referral and for a few months used the shelter and the outreach worker provided by the program. There were bureaucratic outcomes and human ones. Some doors got new locks. Some porch lights got motion sensors. Clara began her side business of home checks and offered a discount to neighbors. I wrote up a long list of practical advice in my notebook: install motion lights at gate level, use cameras with infrared that can manage glare, keep VHF tuned and have a printed list of emergency contacts, anchor boats with multiple knots and check cleats daily, keep a small generator maintained with a sealed log, and use a tracker with dual authentication. The list read like instruction and like a talisman. It was not magic, but it was an action pattern that could be followed. 1 month later, I was back in the city with my apartment window open a crack and an extra set of curtains. Mark and Elena texted updates. Officer Ramirez sent a short email with images from a neighbor's camera that had been overlooked and then recovered. Ben installed a ring of lights and relocated cameras. He told me he slept through an entire night for the first time since the incident. The woman with the limp had enrolled in a day program and left a note for Elena thanking her in a way that was both ashamed and grateful. I felt relief, but it was a cautious relief, the kind that sits like a bandage rather than a cure. I kept my notebook close and made a call to a local nonprofit about integrating outreach with property managers. The bank of memories felt less sharp but more instructive. The rope, the removed prop, the tracker pinging, each item had moved from trauma to a bullet point on the list of how to respond. 3 months later, the county had closed the Lake case for lack of evidence to prosecute. The tape sample had matched a purchase, but without a witness or recorded confessions, it was an associative link rather than a conviction. Ben's neighborhood installed a community watch and a shared camera system, and Clara started a simple checklist for perimeter inspections that neighbors circulated by email. Elena's outreach worker had secured temporary housing for the woman with the limp and arranged a medical clinic appointment. I found that my nights were still punctuated by a readiness: the lantern in my small hallway at home, the habit of checking the nut on a dock that did not exist. Friends asked if I would keep doing these stays, and I hesitated because curiosity was now mixed with responsibility. I kept returning to the idea that stories were not just cautionary tales, but forms of evidence that could change how neighborhoods respond. 3 months later, the county had closed the Lake case for lack of evidence to prosecute. The tape sample had matched a purchase, but without a witness or recorded confessions, it was an associative link rather than a conviction. Ben's neighborhood installed a community watch and a shared camera system, and Clara started a simple checklist for perimeter inspections that neighbors circulated by email. Elena's outreach worker had secured temporary housing for the woman with the limp and arranged a medical clinic appointment. I found that my nights were still punctuated by a readiness: the lantern in my small hallway at home, the habit of checking the nut on a dock that did not exist. Friends asked if I would keep doing these days, and I hesitated because curiosity was now mixed with responsibility. I kept returning to the idea that stories were not just cautionary tales, but forms of evidence that could change how neighborhoods operate. 6 months later, there was a small hearing, at which a merchant confirmed the purchase of the tape to a man who had since moved. The district attorney said the evidence was circumstantial and would not yield a conviction. The juvenile matter at Ben's took a restorative turn. The boy and the family agreed to fence repair and a community service plan that included helping elderly neighbors install simple sensors. Elena's parcel thief remained in the outreach program and had a job at a thrift store, a fragile foothold. I had written the piece I set out to write, but the personal aftershocks did not disappear. I started to run workshops with Clara and a volunteer named Louis, who taught neighbors how to document incidents with timestamps and how to protect chain of custody for footage. The workshops were small and practical, full of checklists and demonstrations: how to tie a cleat knot properly, how to record VHF transmissions, how to bag a fiber sample. People brought their own problems and left with small acts of repair. In private, I kept a lantern by my bed and double-checked the locks on friends' houses and my own. That practice changed me, not by making me fearless, but by making me less forgiving of assumptions that safety is automatic. If there is a lesson in these 3 true stories, it is that vigilance is not the same as paranoia. Vigilance means building habits: check the knot, check the fuel, call a neighbor, log a motion event, keep a record. It means practical steps that translate fear into prevention. It also means recognizing when the person on the other side is not an abstraction, but a human being who may need help. When the woman took Elena's parcel, the solution was not only a lock, but a path to social service. When the teenager ran through Ben's yard, the solution involved community and consequence. When someone worked to isolate a Lakehouse, the solution required forensic patience and a detective who would not dismiss a torn net as wind. And still, some nights I wake to the memory of a light blinking across black water and my hands on a lantern, and I feel that old elastic tightening in my chest. If this story kept you awake, if it shifted how you lock your doors or place your lights, subscribe to the channel for more deeply reported accounts. I am putting together a small guide and links to resources in the description, and your comments help me decide which measures to prioritize next. If you have experienced something similar, write "I would shout" or "I would stay" and tell me why. Your experience matters. I end with the image that has returned to me most nights: a small pool of orange light on a porch board, steady as a pulse, and the dark beyond that light that will always be larger than the pool. We do what we can to make that pool wider. We tie better knots. We make lists. We check VHF channels. We listen. And sometimes we remember to ask whether the person in the dark needs help as much as we need protection.